This case does come with some warnings. It includes sexually graphic torture. Viewer discretion is advised. It's 1999 and a woman awakes to find herself bound to a bed. She is in a small room, naked, and her legs are separated by an iron bar. As she looks around, she spots shelves full of sex toys, surgical equipment, and whips. Adrenaline floods her system as she realizes there are cameras everywhere. Someone is watching her. Then an audio tape begins to play. It's telling her how she is now a sex slave. She belongs to him, and she will never escape. She begins to cry. Little does she know that she's going to be one of the only sole survivors of this predator. This is the case of the Toy Box Killer. This is True Crime with Emma. You can find my podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. You can watch the full documentary on YouTube and TikTok. If you like my content, please feel free to like, subscribe and comment. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 to parents Cecil and Nettie. He had a sister called Peggy. He had an incredibly disturbing childhood. His father Cecil was an alcoholic. He was often absent from the family home. He bonded with his son David by showing him explicit violent pornography from a very young age. Although not confirmed, his mother was possibly a drug addict and often abandoned David and his sister. David was looked after for most of his childhood by his aunt. His aunt, however, was not a loving, caring woman. She was abusive. She would force David as a child to have sex with her and introduced him to her twisted fantasies, including domination and BDSM. She would discuss with David how pain caused her sexual pleasure and would often encourage David's involvement. This incredibly distorted and disturbed, abusive childhood shaped David's sexual development from a young age and had an ongoing impact on how he viewed intimate relationships. In 1949, aged 10 years old, he moved in with his paternal grandmother. She was an uncaring woman who often neglected David. He spent most of his childhood alone and isolated. Around this time, he began journaling. In these early entries of his journal, he described how he got sexual gratification from causing pain and how he was thinking up inventions that he could create himself. He described that whenever he saw a girl, he just imagined how to hurt her. Whilst pleasuring himself, he would imagine raping a girl with a glass bottle. So David, even before the age of 10, had had a horrific upbringing. He was continuously sexually abused by his father and his aunt, and this distorted and disturbed upbringing would taint his childhood and his development forever. Aged just 15, he began looking for his first victim to quench his sexual desires. In 1955, he lured a 15-year-old girl onto his grandmother's ranch. There, he pretended to rape her. It is believed perhaps that this first encounter was actually consensual, as he details how they both enjoyed it. Just 1 year later, when David was 16, he did lure a 16-year-old girl from a small town into the mountainous wilderness. There, he kept her hostage for 2 days. Over the course of those 2 days, he subjected her to torture and rape. We do not know what happened to this young victim, but it is believed that David perhaps used knives to inflict pain. Not knowing how deep to cut or where, it is likely that he was unable to stem the bleeding and that she possibly died of blood loss. David most likely then buried her body in the New Mexico wilderness. This first victim gave David a taste of his depraved desires, and not only that, he got away with it. The true depravity of this case comes from the fact that David was active for years, and during that time, he honed his skill, meaning that he developed more sophisticated ways to torture people. His methods became more extreme, more severe, and more painful. Just after this first kidnapping, David moves in with his maternal grandparents. He attended a new high school where students later recount how David was a meek child. He was shy, often bullied for his short stature, and failed to make eye contact with anyone. Little did his fellow students know how evil David Parker Ray was. In 1957, David is still at high school. He lures a 16-year-old girl into some secluded caves in the wilderness. He has help this time from a woman called Shirley. We never know who this Shirley is, but what we do know is that Shirley enjoyed abusing and sexually torturing these victims just as much as David. So with the help of Shirley, they lured this poor girl into these caves and tortured and raped her for days. Because a lot of this information comes from David's journals, the victims' identities are never known. nor do we know what truly happened to each victim. Were they left at the side of the road disorientated and scared, or were they murdered and buried in the woods? The most likely outcome is that David did murder them. In that same year, Shirley lured another woman for David into those secluded caves. It was a 20-year-old college student, a friend of Shirley's. Shirley stated that there was a party going on in some caves nearby. When this woman got there, David grabbed her. He immediately begins to restrain her. She's screaming, crying for help, looking towards her friend Shirley to help her. Shirley looks straight at her and laughs. It is in this moment that the poor young woman realizes what's happening. She has been betrayed by her friend. Restrained and bound, David then brings out the implements he wishes to use on her, including fish hooks and needles. He used these hooks and needles to pierce sensitive parts of the female body. David derived sexual gratification from inflicting extreme pain onto his victims. After sexually abusing this woman, it is most likely that David murdered her and buried her body in the wilderness. For the next couple of years, David and Shirley continued to abduct young women, torture and rape them. It is likely that Shirley was also from an abusive background, and the sexual pleasure she gained from inflicting violence on others was a form of taking back control from probably her own traumatic childhood. Their third victim was a 17-year-old girl who had a flat tire. David and Shirley came up to her pretending they were going to help. David then punched her straight in the face, loaded her into his truck and drove off. They took her to these secluded caves again and began to torture and rape her for days, before what is most likely murdering and burying the body. The fourth woman was an 18-year-old girl who they met at a bus stop. In similar techniques they'd used before, they lured her into David's truck and whisked her away to these secluded caves. This time, David started experimenting with new torture techniques, including breast clamping, where he would cut off the blood flow to this woman's breast. They also took pliers and plucked out her pubic hair. From his journals, it states that the pain was so immense for her, she eventually passed out. By 1957, David and Shirley had tortured and murdered 4 women. They had inflicted an immense amount of pain and suffering and humiliation onto their victims, all for their own sexual gratification. Both are clearly deprived and twisted individuals. After this, Shirley is no longer mentioned in the journals, so we do not know what happened to her. David moves to Albuquerque and gets a job as a mechanic. He has a sudden growth spurt and shoots up from 5'6" to 6'2". He begins a relationship with a 17-year-old woman. It's a very passionate relationship, and they get married just 1 year later. A year on, they have a son whom they named David. By this point, David Parker Ray has joined the army as a mechanic. He is stationed in South Korea, where it's believed he probably had many other victims. On deployment, his wife struggled. It is believed that perhaps she was a drug addict. She ended up giving their son away, David, for adoption. When David Parker Ray found this out, he immediately returned home and gained custody of his son. However, this didn't last long. He didn't particularly like the father lifestyle, and he ultimately gave his son to his mother to look after whilst he went off into the army again. In 1962, he was honorably discharged and he moved back to New Mexico, where he began dating another woman. They dated for a few months and were married quite quickly. However, just 3 months later, they were divorced. Did this woman suddenly realise how twisted and sick David was? In 1963, he abducted 2 women, a 22-year-old and a 25-year-old. With these poor victims, he introduced a new torture technique again, electricity. He would clamp jump leads to their breast and send electricity through them. It would feel as though they were burning from the inside out. It is bordering on unimaginable, the extreme pain that they must have felt, the excruciating damage it must have done to their internal organs. So at just 23 years old, David has horrifically tortured and possibly murdered 10 women and young girls. He has also abandoned his son and had 2 divorces. In 1966, he met 18-year-old Glenda, who had a son from a previous relationship. Their relationship was passionate and quick, as all David's relationships seem to be. They married very quickly and just 1 year later had a daughter, whom they named Glenda. They nicknamed her Jessie, though, to avoid any confusion. Whilst living a married life with a wife, daughter, and stepson, he continued to abduct, torture, and murder women. In 1973, he abducted 5 women in total. 2 were twin sisters who he tortured for over 5 days. 2 he tortured over a weekend, and 1 was a 30-year-old woman who had a 1-year-old son with her. He described in his journal how the boy was a pain, but he very much enjoyed his mother. He most likely murdered both of them and dumped their bodies in the local lake. It's around this time also that he begins to bond with his daughter Jessie in the only way he knows how. He begins to expose her to violent pornography as he was exposed as a child. He also introduces her to his own sexual deviant fantasies. At a very young age, Jessie was well aware of her father's sadistic tendencies and what he would do to young women. Her father and mother, Glenda, end up divorcing. Her father moves out and buys his own property. It is within this new small town that he connects with a local tight-knit community who enjoy BDSM. Within this group is a lady called Jo Neely. He connects with her over their own BDSM fantasies and they begin to date. His girlfriend Jo Neely enjoys BDSM, but it's very important to point out that there is a obviously big difference between consensual BDSM and the things that David Parker Ray was doing. Jo Neely never knew of what David Parker Ray did, what he did to his victims. So although they did have a very active sex life together and they both enjoyed sort of sadism, it was a very consensual sexual relationship, and Jo Neely had no involvement or knowledge of what David Parker Ray was doing. His daughter, however, did. And in 1986, David and his daughter Jessie got into a huge argument. We don't know what it was about, but Jessie was so angry that in order to seek revenge, she phoned the FBI and told them everything that her father had done, including the surgical equipment he used, the sexual torture devices. The one thing Jessie didn't know were the victims' names, identities, or where they were buried. So the FBI immediately began an investigation, but it stalled. They did bring in David for questioning, and he freely talked about his sexual fantasies, the fact that he was into BDSM, the fact that he fantasized about killing women whilst masturbating. But these aren't crimes, and there was no real evidence. They didn't know any of the victims' identities, and they didn't know where they were buried. So essentially, it was all very circumstantial, and after a year, the case closed. Whilst being investigated by the FBI for that year, David Parker Ray managed to abduct 2 more women. So whilst the FBI are investigating him, he still manages to carry on with his crimes. I'm not sure whether they just didn't bother to kind of tail him and sort of keep an eye on him, but even while the FBI are suspicious about him, he still manages to get away with these extreme, horrific crimes right under their noses. David co-owns a mechanic store with a man named Billy, and in 1987, Billy expressed that he wanted to sell his half of the business. David was incredibly angry at this, to the point where Billy actually did get a little bit scared of him. He said the arguments weren't just sort of normal, slightly heated arguments, they were intense. Days later, Billy goes missing. David is again immediately under suspicion, but with no body, no evidence, no witness to anything, the case is closed. Months later, fishermen are out on their boat in the lake and a body floats up to the surface. However, where this body has been in the lake for so long, they just cannot identify it. They know it's a man. Later, we will then discover that that was Billy, and David Parker Ray murdered his business partner. Later that year, after Billy's disappearance, David captures 2 more women, an 18-year-old sex worker and a 16-year-old runaway. In his journals, he describes sharing them with a friend, which makes it seem as though he had an accomplice. Again, who this was, we never know. Around this time, his daughter also begins helping him, luring young, vulnerable women to her father's residence so that he could torture, rape, and murder them. You can see now kind of the trauma that he has inflicted on his own daughter from exposing her to those violent sexual images as a child. She knows that what her father is doing is illegal, but it's been so normalized for her because it was introduced at such an early age that she doesn't really see anything wrong with it, to the point where she is now helping her dad. 1989, and David Parker Ray has been actively tormenting and murdering young women for 34 years. It is within this year that he purchases the famous trailer, which would later be known as his toy box. He soundproofs it, fills it with sex toys, shelves, cameras, all the surgical equipment that he needs to torture and gain sexual gratification from a poor young woman. In this trailer, he installs a chair, and it's kind of like a gynecological chair. He also hooks it up to electricity. He also has a workbench that has weights to strap people down in. The whole trailer is full of just grotesque, horrific torture devices. Not only that, he has worked on an audio tape that he is going to play to his victims just after he captures them. And this audio tape describes what's going to happen to them, how they're never going to escape, and how their lives are going to end, and that they are now his sex slave. David Parker Ray not only enjoyed the physical infliction of pain, he loved the psychological torment that he could inflict on his victims, and this audio tape did just that. It raised their fear, pumped adrenaline through their system, knowing what was going to happen to them, but not being able to do anything. So what he would do was he would lure his victims into the trailer, strap them down, leave. He had cameras everywhere where he could watch them whilst he began playing this audio recording. Decades of not being caught and perfecting his technique had led to this. He would sit that lady down, he would play the audio tape and just watch as they cried in fear. He also designed and created torture tools that would stimulate the pain of childbirth. He had barbed steel bras, nipple screws, weights that would stretch sensitive parts of the female body. Throughout all this time, he was married to Jo Neely, and she had no idea what was going on. By 1993, their marriage began to disintegrate. He said that Jo Neely was crazy. She had many epileptic fits. At one point, she put a gun to his head, and so they kind of drifted apart, divorced, and separated. After the divorce, David got a job at a local state park, earning him an official government position. Making him appear more trustworthy, it was easier for him to abduct women. He also had unlimited access to the wilderness. In 1995, he abducted 3 women. He took them to his toy box. He also began designing wooden boxes in which to store the women in, meaning he could capture more than one woman at once. This brought new psychological torture to his victims. Each woman could hear the other's pain, cries for help, making the entire situation more terrifying. David thrived off the psychological torture he could inflict, and having both women captured at once fulfilled this. One evening in 1996, he received a phone call from his daughter Jessie, telling him that she would be delivering him another toy to play with. This was 23-year-old Kelly Van Cleve. It was Jessie Ray's friend. She offered to give her a lift home from the bar. As they were making their way home, Jessie said to Kelly that she needed to stop off at her house. Once there, Kelly followed Jessie inside her home. David Ray came in and pointed a knife towards Kelly's face. He stated that she now belonged to him. In complete shock, Kelly looked towards her friend for support. However, Jessie came in with handcuffs and placed them around Kelly's wrists. They walked her to the trailer, and as she sat down, she saw signs saying "Welcome to Satan's Den." They forced her onto a bench where they strapped her down and spread her legs. They stripped her naked and began filming. They then began playing the audio tapes describing what was going to happen to her. You can only imagine the fear that was going through Kelly's mind. Not only that, but the complete confusion of being abducted by your own friend. She was there for 3 days. 3 days of torture and rape. David actually began to get quite frustrated because due to a medical condition that Kelly has, he couldn't use some of his implements on her to their full extent. By the 3rd day, frustrated, he drugged Kelly with a cocktail of medication. The next thing Kelly remembers is being outside of her own home. David dragged her to the front door of her own home, knocked, and her husband answered. Kelly was relieved. Tears started to flow. She couldn't really remember much of what had happened to her at the time because of how much medication David had given her. Her husband, however, seemed angry. He accused her of running off with another man. David said that he had found her wandering around the lake when he was out on patrol and that she is clearly on drugs. Her husband was so furious. He declared he was going to divorce her and slammed the door in her face. Kelly had to get back in the truck with David and he dropped her off at a friend's house. Her memories from the 3 days of torment were fragmented and she couldn't really remember much, so she never went to the police. A little time later, David and his daughter Jessie met 36-year-old Cindy Hendy. She was new to town after escaping an abusive relationship. She fancied David immediately and they began a relationship. While socializing in town, Cindy met 24-year-old Dennis Yancey, who was a local criminal. She introduced him to David and Jessie. Soon the four of them all realized that they had a shared sexual fantasy of sadism and torture. Later that year, in 1997, David gave them a tour of his toy box and the macabre activities that went on there. From then on, both Dennis and Cindy helped and participated in the abduction and torture of young women. One of the victims was 22-year-old Maria Park. She was a mother of 2 young children and Dennis Yancey's ex-girlfriend. She was a drug addict and lived in a tent. She had a very troubled life. When she broke up with Dennis due to his abusive and controlling behaviour, Dennis did not like this and wanted to seek revenge. So he, along with David, abducted Marie and kept her as a sex slave. Her disappearance was reported by a friend, but where she was a vagrant, she didn't have a job, she lived in a tent by a lake. It was very difficult for the police to investigate. She was being tortured in David's toy box, not for just days, but for weeks on end. David, Dennis and Cindy all participated in the torture and rape of young Marie. When they were done, Dennis was given the job of murdering her. He strangled her and buried her in the middle of the wilderness. Her body has never been found. It is unknown how many women these 4 abducted and murdered, subjecting them to horrific amounts of torture. In 1998, Cindy moved in with David, making their entire setup more intimate. She could be more closely involved with the torture and sexual abuse of these victims. In 1999, Angelica Montanio, who was a well-liked and known member of the town, she was very friendly. She was a known sex worker and a friend of Cindy and David's. She wanted to make a cake for her boyfriend. David and Cindy said that they had cake mix left over, which they didn't need to use, so were very willing to give it to her. Angelica turned up at David's trailer to collect it. So Angelica just needed to come by the house to collect the ingredients. She didn't really think much of this because she knew David and Cindy really well. When she entered their home, David threatened her with a knife. She begins laughing, thinking that it's just a joke. These people are her friends. But then David punches her in the face, strips her naked, takes her into the bedroom and chains her to the bed. David and Cindy rape and torture Angelica for 2 days, whilst also administering a cocktail of drugs. After 2 days of rape and torture, they begin to use electricity to inflict pain. This lasted for a further 3 days. In order to survive, Angelica came up with an idea. She decided that she would make out that she enjoyed the torture, that she got pleasure from sexual pain. After a while, she managed to convince David to let her free. She said that her boys would be worried, they'd alert the police, and they'd come round looking for her. This caused a serious argument between David and Cindy. Cindy did not want to let her go, but David disagreed and let Angelica go. She promised not to tell anyone what had happened in that home. They dumped Angelica at the side of an isolated road. She decided to try and hitchhike back to town. As she was walking down the road, a police officer drove by. He pulled over to help her. Whilst in the car, she began to tell him exactly what had happened to her, all the sexual torture she had received, and who had done this to her. The police officer, however, did not believe a word of what she said. He did not think she was a credible victim and just thought she was a drug addict and high. making up stories. Opportunity to stop David had just slipped away because this police officer just did not believe what Angelica was saying. In 1999, David and Cindy go out looking for their next victim. They are specifically looking for a sex worker, and they stumble upon a lady named Cynthia Vigil. They were 150 miles from Albuquerque, and they convinced Cynthia to get in the trailer. When she entered the trailer, Cindy was there with a stun gun. She immediately tasered Cynthia, handcuffed her wrists, and locked her in a box. They then drove the 150 miles home to Albuquerque. Once home, they escorted Cynthia into the bedroom where they chained her to the bed. They began playing their audio tapes, which inflicted an enormous amount of psychological torture. Cynthia was there for 2 days, and she was tormented and raped continuously. One day, they loosened Cynthia's chains that tie her to the bed in order for her to use the toilet. They left the chains loose as they were going to take her to the trailer later. David left the house to go to the store, and Cindy settled down and watched telly. Cynthia looked around the room and realised that Cindy had left the keys to the locks on the bedside table. As she stretched her limbs, she managed to grab the keys and carefully unlock the chains that tied her limbs together. There was no key for the dog collar, but she could unlock the chain from the wall it was attached to. Once free, she sprinted into the front room, where she discovered that Cindy was blocking the exit. Cindy jumped up and screamed. She grabbed a lamp and tried to attack Cynthia. Cynthia acted quickly. She grabbed an ice pick, which was on the table next to her, ran at Cindy and plunged it into the back of her neck. Cindy fell down and Cynthia ran for the front door. She began running down the street. This woman was naked with just a dog collar on. Neighbours saw and raised the alarm, calling the police. David Parker Ray's 45 years of torment, murder and rape had ended. At 59 years of age, he had spent the majority of his life abusing, murdering and raping women. Once arrested, Kelly Van Cleve was willing to testify against David, along with Angelica Montaño. David never gave the names and identities of any of his other victims. Jessie, his daughter, and Cindy, his partner, were questioned. Jessie pled the fifth, but Cindy talked, stating that David had murdered his former business partner, Billy, and had forced Dennis to murder Marie Parker. They arrested Dennis Yancey for his crimes, and he admitted to everything. They searched for the bodies but never found any. It is possible that David Parker Ray had up to 60 victims. Because there were no bodies, David Parker Ray was actually never convicted of murder or charged with it. But from the 3 testimonies from the women, Kelly, Angelica, and Cynthia, he was charged with many other offences, including kidnapping, assault, unlawful sexual penetration. And in 2001, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. However, he barely served any of this sentence, as months after being imprisoned, he died from a heart attack in 2002. Cindy Hendy received a 36-year prison sentence and was released in 2019. Dennis Yancey received 2 consecutive 15-year sentences for second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. He was initially paroled in 2011, but after a parole violation, he served additional time until he was released in 2021. Jessie Ray, so David's daughter, pleaded no contest to kidnapping. She received a 9-year prison sentence, 6 of which could be served on parole. They have tried to search for the victims and possible bodies of David Parker Ray, but it has been unsuccessful. That was the horrific case of the sadistic David Parker Ray, the toy box killer. If they had just taken some of his victims more seriously, or kept tabs on him when his daughter actually ratted him out years ago, how many lives could have been saved? It has taken me a while to do this video. It's a bit longer than what I usually do. You'll also see, if you're watching this, that there's an outfit change, various things going on. The schools were off because of a heat wave and things, but yes, managed to do it. I hope you have enjoyed it. As always, if you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment so that you can join us next time.